Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Leszek Buszynski, professor at the Australian National University's College for Asia and the Pacific, and author of Negotiating with North Korea, the Six-Party Talks and the Nuclear Issue, and it's this book that will be the topic for today's interview. It is always hard to glean what North Korea really want, but one of the few things that seemed to have stuck out from the early years after the Korean War was their gaze on nuclear weapons. They were aware that America had them. They became aware after the war that Douglas MacArthur wanted to use them, and they saw in the eyes of their Soviet big brothers how America's arsenal of nuclear weapons managed to deter the Soviet Union from engaging fully in the conflict itself. From this moment, nuclear weapons hover over the Korean peninsula in almost all aspects of political and social life. North Korea under Kim Il-sung are quick to sign agreements with the Soviet Union to build light water reactors, to share nuclear programs, and to train nuclear scientists. Where and when this gap wouldn't be filled by the Soviet Union, North Korea began building it themselves. An indigenous nuclear program sprung up, as well as an outreach program across the world to try and buy nuclear secrets. And in 1994, this all comes to a sharp point. Watching from satellites above, America is beginning to realize that North Korea are moving processed plutonium out of their civilian reactors and away to what they can only assume is a military purpose. And from this concern comes the agreed framework. North Korea agreeing to freeze its programs and allow IAEA inspectors into the country in exchange for a supply of heavy oil from the United States and what amounts to a negative security guarantee for their country. But before long, the agreement has broken down and the world is pushing for a new type of diplomacy, something that would put a permanent end to North Korea's nuclear program and bring them permanently away from the position of being a rogue power. There are six parties: Russia, China, Japan, America, South Korea, and North Korea, all moved into these talks with high hopes, and yet they all begin to immediately undermine the same talks through hidden agendas and completely different understandings of what denuclearization would mean. Japan come across distracted by other issues. South Korea rosy-eyed by the hopes of reunification. Russia hoping to reassert its influence through Northeast Asia. China manipulating its position as a swing player in the negotiations. And America firm, intransigent, and aggressive. Which of course leaves North Korea the target of the entire discussion itself, who throughout the process managed to play a brilliant diplomatic game. They feed off the behavior of the other actors. They learn what the other actors think about them, and they respond in kind, asking for a series of changing negotiating positions. The talks themselves, through 6 rounds and multiple sessions, reflect more than anything North Korea. They roll from day to day, week to week, as a roller coaster. Positions change and attitudes shift. The image that emerges is a North Korean state that is impossible to talk to, impossible to negotiate with, and beyond this, absolutely unwilling to give up their nuclear weapons, despite agreeing before these talks that was the purpose of the discussions themselves. Through Leszek Buszynski's book, he begins to paint this picture up, and you begin to see just how fraught, just how challenging such a large-scale diplomatic undertaking can be, and just how poorly we understand North Korea. Through this interview with Leszek, we will draw this out in detail, focus in on North Korea's nuclear program, its missile tests, its diplomatic strategies, and importantly, what it really wants from the world. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please consider contributing at the Patreon page attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Leszek Buszynski. Leszek Buszynski, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Right.
So we're going to walk through your book today, Negotiating with North Korea, the Six-Party Talks and the Nuclear Issue. But I suppose it is important to first push back a little bit to a different scene altogether, to the early 1990s and to the agreed framework. So what was that and why did it come about?
What was the agreed framework of October 94? Well, it was an end to the 93-94 nuclear crisis. And some people regarded that as a final end, that it would remove the nuclear issue as a problem for the US. But really, it was simply a temporary expedient, a move that to pressure of the issue for the Americans, and it postponed many of the essential points that would have to be dealt with to a much later date. So all in all, it was a temporary resolution of a crisis at that stage, with the major points postponed for resolution until a much later date.
So what was that crisis just in particular? So for people listening, they may not have a full image of what North Korea's nuclear program looked like, or how large or how small it was. So what was that crisis that brought about the agreed framework?
Well, the crisis was triggered by the detection by the US and the International Atomic Energy Agency of an ongoing nuclear program by the North, and that was early '93. Of course, there have been indications before then, and North Korea's effort to evade inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and refused to cooperate in terms of making an accounting of stockpiles of plutonium. And then the US got involved, the Clinton administration got involved, because they feared that North Korea was on the way to stockpiling plutonium for the manufacture of nuclear weapons, and it became a major crisis. And at that in '94, within the Clinton administration, there was an effort to, and they went so far as to think about actually launching a surgical strike upon the North. And there was considerable support for this until Jimmy Carter went to Pyongyang and met Kim Il-sung, and then his talks with the then North Korean leader formed the basis of the subsequent agreed framework. That is to say that there would be a suspension, there would be a freeze of whatever the North Koreans were doing, and then the pressure upon the North would ease off, and there would be aid and assistance for the North in various ways. So basically, the '93-'94 crisis was all about North Korea's effort to develop a nuclear weapons capability to stockpile plutonium, for which it had agreed earlier to give an accounting to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that's what triggered the whole crisis. And it was Jimmy Carter's visit to Pyongyang in June '94 which eased tensions, and that eventually led to the agreed framework of October '94. Which, as I said, simply postponed the major issues. And the major issue that was postponed was inspection, and that was left pending.
So that is a very important point to touch on, because this is going to bleed through the whole six-party talks program. So this idea of inspections, and particularly verification, is one that becomes a huge stumbling block both at this time and into the future. So why did the Americans, as you said, they were very close to having a surgical strike, so they were taking this very, very seriously. But they allowed an agreement to go forward, and in the same sense, they postponed all verification and all inspections, and they allowed North Korea to do it on good faith, so to speak. Is that accurate to say that?
Right. Well, at that stage, verification was a key issue, and then the other part of the story was that they agreed to, so the Americans or the international community agreed to supply the North with heavy oil for heating purposes. This is a distinction made between oil that could be used for other purposes, military purposes, and oil that is thick and sloshy that could be only used for heating purposes to heat North Korean homes and apartments during the winter. They came to that agreement, and they came to agreement and other issues were related to this, such as diplomatic resolution, diplomatic recognition, and so forth, which were in tow. But the major issue was for the North Koreans was the supply of heavy oil, and also the establishment of KEDO, KEDO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, which was supposed to manage supplies of heavy oil to the north, and also to provide the north with a substitute light water reactor which would not be able to produce plutonium, and which would be approved by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And in this context, the whole thing was meant to be resolved, that the north would then forego its existing plutonium program, would accept a light water a nuclear reactor, would accept deliveries of heavy oil, and then the issue would eventually de-escalate, would go away, and diplomatic recognition would follow, and gradually the North would be integrated into some kind of Northeast Asian community. Now, that was the plan throughout the 1990s. And they thought that, and many people, optimists, when it came to the nuclear issue, thought that the issue could be resolved in this way. So the agreed framework had much support, and many people thought that that the issues that were postponed would eventually be resolved in that context. Verification, inspections, regular inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency would follow as a natural consequence.
And then, of course, in 2000, there's a US presidential election, and George W. Bush comes to power, and he very quickly becomes dissatisfied with this agreed framework, and he pushes through a review of the process, and then he seeks to change it itself. And not soon after that, the whole thing collapses. So what happened there?
Well, there are other issues that, other things that occurred along the way. You had William Perry, former defense secretary, who was very positive about engaging with the North, and he wrote the famous Perry report saying that the North was moving ahead, that the North was had actually accepted the freeze, that there was a freeze on the plutonium program, and that could be verified, and so forth. And what should follow would be engagement of the North, dialogue, engagement, diplomatic recognition, and so forth. But then, before we get to the elections, the American intelligence started to detect something that disturbed the Americans, and that was that the North was moving ahead with a clandestine enriched uranium program. There were indications of this because there was the AQ Khan network from Pakistan, which was, and the regular contacts between this network in Pakistan that was peddling nuclear technology, including technology for the development of an enriched uranium nuclear capability. And then there were the American intelligence started to pick up the links between this Pakistani network and developments in the North, and they were quite ominous. It seemed to the Americans that they may have frozen the plutonium program, put that out of sight, but yet they were going ahead with the enriched uranium program, so that by the time that George Bush came into office, the Americans were disturbed by what they regarded as duplicity from the North, and that was when James Kelly confronted the North in 2002 with evidence of the clandestine enriched uranium nuclear program, and the Americans thought, at least, that they gained that the North Koreans had admitted to this.
James Kelly claimed that, didn't he? When he went there, he said afterwards that they actually said, "You got us," effectively, and then they changed their mind afterwards.
Right. Now, there are varying interpretations of this. Some have said that the North actually said they had the capability to develop this program. But others have said that actually the North boasted of having this program, and the Korean language seemed to indicate that. And a number of Korean language experts looked at the text and seemed to think that the Kelly interpretation was the right, on the balance of nuances, was the right interpretation, and it seemed as though that they were somehow boasting of having this program and thumbing their noses at the Americans. And so it was at that point that the Bush administration reacted in furious anger at the North, and then you had all these consequences followed. And the major one being, of course, the burial of the agreed framework. The Americans wanted to ditch it and wanted to start anew in terms of dealing with the North. So there, and this whole point about the enriched uranium nuclear program, I think, is being missed. There are many supporters of the agreed framework, and many people who think that the Bush administration had done great damage to America's position in its relationship, tend to neglect that. And perhaps the Bush administration went too far. Undoubtedly it did. But it had to have a response to this duplicity on the part of the North Koreans. It had to deal with that. The North Koreans were simply not above board on this occasion.
And just for people listening, am I right to assume that a uranium enrichment program is a much more advanced, much more versatile, much more dangerous type of nuclear program than a plutonium nuclear program?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I wouldn't say more. You could just say that a plutonium program would be much more dangerous because of the potential power. A plutonium bomb could be a lot more powerful than one that uses enriched uranium. But certainly, it's a different technology. It's a kind of technology that the Iranians are using today. So I wouldn't say that it's more powerful. It uses a different technology and probably a more complex technology because of all the issues that are involved.
So were they diversifying their program here just for themselves, or was this a way to skirt the strict language of the agreed framework and to move away from a plutonium program and have a uranium program?
Well, as a backup, if they could have a clandestine program like this, and their strategy was, as far as we can make out, that they would have the Americans committed to the agreed framework and things would move along quite happily. They would demonstrate that they've frozen the plutonium program, and they would come to some kind of agreement with the Americans, and they will have their nuclear insurance. This is what they wanted all along, some kind of insurance for their position, and they would have this program, and they would hope that the Americans would somehow turn a blind eye to this for the sake of the good relationship with the North. And then things would end happily ever after that, but it wasn't so.
So after the agreed framework breaks down, it dwindles for a few years and nothing much happens, and eventually through I guess a building of a new crisis, a new series of talks are brought together, and these are the six-party talks. So right. I might get you to start just on the hope that was there, because these were pushed forward as this great big bastion of East Asian regionalism that the world was struggling to overcome its Cold War heritage, and through this sort of diplomacy, East Asia was going to show the world how to do it. Right.
Yeah. There's a good deal of, and I think this is typical of this whole issue of dealing with North Korea. There's a good deal of illusion spawned over the issue, and particularly expectations and hopes were elevated and were inflated by the six-party talks, and especially when the academic community got involved, they started to build or develop ideas of regionalism and ways of integrating North Korea into the international economic order, and that would resolve most of the issues, outstanding issues that these countries were confronted with. that was I think delusion on the part of many. It wasn't to be, it could never be, and it seems that the North Koreans were very clever in terms of manipulating the expectations of the international public. Many people believed that the North Koreans would give up their nuclear weapons and that they would come to an agreement with the international community, that they would accept economic aid, and they believed that the whole issue was simply about bargaining for economic aid, and eventually, within the framework of the six-party talks, all these great things would happen. They were master manipulators of images, and images. The whole issue concerned international images, and I think they quickly understood that if you can appeal to the American public or to the expectations of the international community, you could put pressure upon negotiators, and that's one way of getting what you want. I think the North Koreans understood that.
Sure. And so in September 2003, North Korea actually admit that it has reprocessed enough enough plutonium for 4 to 6 nuclear devices. And actually in 2004, Americans go in and they confirm that this has been done. So it might be a decent time just to look into the 6 parties themselves. Leave North Korea aside for just a second and look at the 5 parties that come to the table. So if you might start with Japan, they seemed, at least from what I can gather, they seem to get a lot of flack after the talks. That people look at them like they didn't come in seeking denuclearization. That they got sidetracked by things such as the abduction issue, and they got stuck on smaller things such as their own place in Asia. Is this a correct view?
Yes, Japanese policy was hijacked by the abduction issue. It became a very powerful issue for the Japanese public, and Japanese negotiators were compelled, obliged to raise this at every turn. It's a very emotional issue for the Japanese public, and the other issue that concerned the Japanese was relationship with Korea itself, because what they wanted, they understood very well that North Korean nuclear weapons or North Korean weapons of mass destruction could be turned against Japan, and therefore they wanted some kind of protection against that possibility. So what concerned the Japanese was to maintain the relationship with the US and to ensure that the US or neither the US nor South Korea would come to some kind of deal with North Korea to their disadvantage, which would cut them out. So they were obliged to maintain a rather hardline position for that reason. They couldn't go ahead with those people, with those movements in both the South and the United States that wanted to rapidly engage the North and so forth. They couldn't abide that, because that would mean cutting loose their own position on the issue, and that would mean that uncertainty with regard to what the Americans were doing. So they were compelled, for these two reasons, to maintain a hardline position. For that they were accused, and for that they copped the flack that you mentioned.
And so if we dig now into the country that you just mentioned there, South Korea, and their more friendly sort of engagement with North Korea. One of the things running through South Korea's approach to North Korea seems to have been all along this future specter of reunification. So they, as much as they want denuclearization, they see these talks as also a way to build friendship, to build financial engagement, and to sort of downplay the future costs of any long-term reunification. Is this correct or not?
Yeah. Now, when we come to South Korea, we find a very complex situation. Then the president was Roh Moo-hyun, and he, with his Odi party behind him, Odi party supporters behind him, they developed, I think, a very optimistic view of the situation. They felt that they could engage the North. In fact, I see this every time. I see that every time that there's the possibility of engagement with the North over some issue in the South, you see this movement in South Korean politics. They tend to downplay the hardline position adopted by the conservatives in the South, and the expectations are raised, and national sentiment tends to become prominent. And then in that case, in terms of Roh Moo-hyun and the six-party negotiations, they regarded the six-party talks as a means to bring North and South closer, reconciliation, positioning the South for eventual reunification, and downplaying the costs, as he mentioned, and so forth. And that meant that had certain repercussions for negotiations that I want to point out. It meant closer alignment with China over many of these issues, because they felt that China was the key to the whole issue. And it also meant introducing strains into the alliance relationship with the Americans, considerable strains, and it also meant tension with the Japanese, because the Japanese were accused of adopting this hardline position that we talked about earlier. And so Roh Moo-hyun was caught in a particular bind, because he was moved by this national sentiment, by this feeling of bringing the two Koreas together again, and yet at the same time he was hampered and constrained by strategic restrictions, such as the alliance with the US and the need to maintain a united position with the Western world, and also with China to some extent. He couldn't move ahead of what the Chinese, the pace at which the Chinese were prepared to go. So he was biting the bit, so to speak. He was quite, he and his supporters were quite impatient and had difficulty dealing with their own position in these negotiations, and so they tended to fluctuate, and there was considerable inconsistency in his point of view, in his negotiating position. So he couldn't be a conservative. He couldn't adopt a position adopted subsequently by someone like Im Yoon-bak, for example, who came from the conservative side of South Korean politics, because he was being pushed by this wave of national sentiment. And that happens every time that there are negotiations with the North. And we're seeing this on this occasion as well. Yet at the same time, he couldn't fulfill on the promises or the expectations that this wave of national sentiment generated. And so result was considerable resentment directed against the Americans, revival of hostility towards the Japanese, that other people were preventing dialogue with the North and preventing possible reconciliation and reunification and so forth. These issues were not resolved within the South Korean delegation.
So in there you mentioned China, so we might move on to China and Russia here and just look at them both together, though they both play very different roles. So Beijing hosts the talks, so they play this mediator's role throughout much of the discussion itself. But both China and Russia seem to want to return to the agreed framework, and of course America are very adamant that this is not an option throughout the whole process. But Russia seem to play this role where they sit back and they're almost indifferent, and they let the other nations run it, and they are a periphery figure to an awful lot of this. Well, Beijing come across as a very intelligent, almost exploitative country that are willing to play this swing role and willing to take advantage of the need of its neighbors to want to have a peaceful negotiation with North Korea.
Right. Well, let's deal with Russia first.
Sure, do that.
Yeah, because yes, you're right that Russia had this was I suppose behind the scenes in many respects in negotiations, and the Russian delegation simply tried to exploit the opportunities raised by the Chinese and by the South Koreans in negotiations. But they were clear about one thing, and that was that the negotiations, the purpose of the negotiations were to enable Russia to maintain a position in the north, position which it could then exploit when reunification comes about. They are very clear that they wanted to keep the north in being, and they would then use this position in the Korean Peninsula as a way of countering the United States and as a way of countering Japan. The Russians were masterful chess players in that reason. We see this similar. We see these attributes on this occasion in relation to what Putin is doing in Syria. So using a particular position, and despite what others are saying, despite whatever criticisms others may raise, and in this respect, the Russians allied very carefully with the Chinese. Of course, there were tensions between them, but they were masked by the united position that they both developed within the six-party negotiations.
Sure. So if we push on to China now, this role that they play, there's a lot of cliches that come out about China, that they talk hard, that they really want to push North Korea towards denuclearization, but deep down they just want deeper cooperation. They want a buffer zone against the US and Japan, and they want North to be prosperous and a trading nation. And some of this begins to play out, at least in times during the six-party talks, with China in this uniquely powerful role as mediator, where they can play each side off each other.
Right. The Chinese position was quite complex, and I might add here that within China there were different views, very different views. There were those who thought that China should not be led by North Korea, that the North Koreans were leading China into a dangerous situation of peninsula where, in relation to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that the last thing they wanted was a nuclear-armed North Korea, which would make things very dangerous for China, because that would lead to a cascading situation where Japan would get nuclear weapons and possibly even the South Korea. And we note in this context that there have been some voices in South Korea saying that the South should arm itself with nuclear weapons against the possibility of a North Korea that could use such weapons in the area. So that was one side of the Chinese position. The other side was, of course, to support the North. The North was important to China, not only in terms of buffer state theory, which many Chinese denied, but but the North is an important counter against the American presence in the South, against the American alliance with South Korea and the American alliance with Japan. So, and they weren't going to give that up. Not at all. So, but the Chinese were caught in their own dilemma for that reason, and they tried to, and sometimes you can see that the support, the resentments, exasperations. The Chinese were exasperated by the North because they had little control over the North Korean leadership, little control over what the North Koreans were doing, and therefore they couldn't really control the situation themselves. They wanted to keep the North in being. They wanted the North as a counter, as an ally, to be used against the American alliance network in Northeast Asia, but they had little control of the North Koreans. The North Koreans could lead them into crisis and situations which could be quite dangerous for their own position in that area. We saw this quite recently with Kim Jong-un's development of ballistic missile capability. That is that clearly frustrated the Chinese. there were times when the North and the Chinese, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-il at that stage, and the Chinese rarely communicated. There were situations in which the Chinese expressed their utter exasperation with the North, but the North simply ignored them and went ahead with their own plans. The Chinese warned the North Koreans not to develop their nuclear program, not to engage in nuclear tests, not to develop their ballistic missile program, and the North Korean leadership seemed to have particular delight in demonstrating their own independence of China. So the Chinese relationship with North Korea was extremely complex, but it was enough for the Chinese to have the North Koreans in being, to have them exist or to have the North Korea to survive as a separate state, as long as it didn't go too far in terms of the development of its nuclear weapons program or its ballistic missile program. But they could never control that. They could never stop them from doing that.
Yeah, so I suppose after that it's important to move on to America, which is, of course, the big actor in all of this. And as we mentioned previously, George W. Bush has come to power, and he's taken a very hard line based on the sort of problems that he's seen in the past, and what he takes as North Korean intransigence here. And of course, a lot of this comes off the back. He has this speech when he calls North Korea the axis of evil. In 2003, there's also a spy plane incident when the North Koreans intercept a US spy plane. And running through an awful lot of this is an American conviction that if North Korea do proliferate their program, that they will sell these nuclear materials to maybe to terrorist organizations or to other states themselves, and certainly that they will start threatening the region in the way that they have already previously. So to run through a little bit of this, there's a feeling that I got, at least reading part of your book here, that America was the only one out of the 5 powers that came to this that had a single unified goal, which was denuclearization. They're the least one that was distracted by other programs. Is this correct?
Least one that was distracted by other programs. Well, at the beginning, yes. But I think if you look at later chapters of the book and you see that the Bush administrations frantically tried to come to some kind of agreement with the North as pressure upon the North didn't work. The Bush administration expected the Chinese to bring North Korea to heel. The Chinese weren't willing to do so, and they understood. They began to understand. The Americans understood what the Chinese were up to, what their strategic plans were, the strategic goals, and therefore these expectations were dashed that the Chinese would resolve the situation. So then, towards the end of the six-party talks, there was a frantic movement on the part of the Bush administration to some kind of agreement with the North, particularly after the destruction of Yongbyon, the Berlin talks, and so forth. And the Bush administration, elements within the Bush administration, that is the State Department, were willing to gloss over the issue of verification. And that's clear. That comes out clearly in one of the chapters that of that book. But by that time, of course, the situation had changed dramatically, and the North wasn't interested because it had moved ahead with this nuclear weapons program anyway.
So why was America so disinterested? Well, not disinterested, but why were they willing to give up verification at this point? Because that was one of the large stalling points of the agreed framework. And now George Bush is willing to give it up after a few years of troubles with the North.
Well, I wouldn't say give up. There are nuances here. They're willing to make it easier for the North to accept verification in terms of how it would be conducted, and that in particular the State Department was willing to do. Within the National Security Council and elsewhere within the US, there was considerable resistance for this. So it was a matter not surrendering, but to make it easier in terms of challenge inspections and so forth. Normally, in terms of verification, you would have the IAEA would have the right to raise challenge inspections, but if those could be somehow negotiated and not imposed upon the North, then that would become more acceptable. So they're looking at ways to make verification easier.
Was there a degree of trophy hunting in all of this, that Bush, with his looking towards the end of his potential time in power, and with a failure to piece together Israel and Palestine, of course, that he wanted something on his record, a great foreign policy success?
Yeah, I think that's right. If you put it in terms of trophy hunting, I think that's an obsession and a particular desire that most presidents are afflicted with towards the end of their term of office. Yes, I think that's right. He wanted to resolve the situation, he wanted to settle it, and he wanted to go down in history as the president who had arranged this. But he ran out of time, and not only that, but I don't think the US was in a position to resolve the issue anyway.
So if we dig deeper into the actual dynamics of the talks themselves here, one of the things that I do take away from your book is this important idea that despite people's original intentions and the original negotiating positions, once these actual talks start, they automatically get pulled out of position, and the actors spend an awful lot of time reacting to each other. They read each other's behaviors and they change their intentions based on those behaviors.
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. That's the interaction is not just between US and the North, but between the players themselves. They interact with each other, and that interaction resulted in transformation, changes of position, a very fluid situation, which the North could exploit. I think the North understood that very, very well. I interviewed a few people who were engaged in negotiating with the North, and they mentioned that point, that the North knew how to play its cards, knew what was going on, and knew how to release information in order to stimulate that interaction. That information invariably was about the North's willingness to agree to something, and that, of course, and then exacerbated differences between hardliners and the optimists within the talks and so forth. And then they would withdraw from that position, and they wouldn't come up with anything after that, and they couldn't deliver on their promises, and that's reinvigorated the whole interaction that you speak of. So they played the game very cleverly in that respect.
So I suppose that's an interesting point to start on here. So if we move on to North Korea, what did they want? So they're playing this strange game when, as you said, a lot of diplomats would walk in with one thing and they'd ask North Korea what they wanted. They would get a series of demands. In some cases, they gave them those demands and North Korea would just put it in their pocket and move on to something else as if it didn't matter in the first place. So here's the impossible question, I suppose. What did North Korea want through all of this?
Well, through all of this, what they wanted was time. I think that's the key essential point. Now, when we say who wanted what, the top North Korean leadership, Kim Jong-il, those around him, not necessarily the negotiators that six-party that the Americans or the others had to deal with. And it is very unclear, but it seems to us that the North Korean negotiators were kept on a tight leash, were kept in the dark, and simply were given their orders, their instructions, and they went into negotiations with this proposal or this idea. Then later they were told to scotch this idea, give up that idea. But what they wanted was time. What they wanted was they quickly understood that the North Korea, that the six-party talks worked at their advantage. It gave them time to develop their nuclear program, gave them time to develop their ballistic missile capability, and they understood that both China and Russia were supporters in that respect. So once they had achieved a certain level of development in both programs, the ballistic missile program, the nuclear program, then the six-party talks became unimportant. They started to raise difficulties, and eventually by 2009 they withdrew. They had no need of these negotiations anymore.
At one point, you do mention as well that they changed their position. So these talks are all about denuclearization, and North Korea agreed to this going into the talks themselves. And at one point, you mentioned that they simply stopped talking about this. They don't want to talk about denuclearization anymore. And what they want to now talk about is being recognized as a nuclear power, and entirely shift in the direction of the whole discussion itself.
That's right. So while they needed time to develop these programs, the whole debate, the whole issue was about denuclearization. They had to accept that, and they tantalizingly put the issue of denuclearization on the program, on the agenda of the talks, in order to engage the Americans in particular in discussions and give them time. They feared that the Americans would launch would create another Iraq. In the Korean Peninsula. That was a very great fear, that Americans would engage in a military strike and destroy their capability and possibly destroy the state. So if they could somehow pin the Americans down in these ongoing negotiations, frustrating as it may be for the Americans, but sufficient to give them time to develop their capability in both areas, missile capability and nuclear capability, then the whole thing had a certain purpose, and they had to accede to the agenda of denuclearization. But once they developed their capabilities in both areas to a sufficient level, they could simply move on to the next stage, and then attempt to change the agenda of the negotiations to one of to move from denuclearization towards reduction of nuclear weapons, to be treated as a nuclear state, and to demand of the Americans that they also engage in reductions of nuclear weapons before they could start negotiating with the North. This was the element of boasting amongst within the North Korean leadership, to show the world and to show the domestic audience in particular that North Korea had made it, and could not be treated as an underling, so to speak, that it had reached the level or the status of a nuclear power and should be treated accordingly. Yes, that shift was made just around 2009 as they began to move away from the six-party talks.
So I suppose this is a useful time to ask a question here, just about what North Korea is trying to actually achieve throughout this program. So there's a lot of people out there that will throw away these sort of flippant ideas that North Korea wants nuclear weapons for an offensive capability, or they want them for a defensive capability, or all sorts of things like they want them just for bargaining programs. And of course, they do ask for a number of things during the discussions. They want they want a normalization of relations. They want a non-aggression pact. They want access to economic aid, and all sorts of things like this. So what exactly do you think the actual original purpose of this program is for North Korea?
The original purpose, number one purpose, was to prevent the Americans from attacking the North. That's something they feared. But that was a development of, that's a subsequent development. That was the intention, particularly after the Americans invaded Iraq in 2003. That they feared the Americans would do something to them. But you go back in time to the first nuclear crisis, 93-94, at the time when there was no American threat to the North, at the time when the regime wasn't particularly threatened by anyone at that time. It was a means of protection, a means of gaining status, protection for the regime. And this was the nuclear program was developed with Soviet support. At that stage, from the Soviet perspective, it was a way of defending socialism, defending the socialist camp against the imperialists, so that it was a defense of the regime. And this is I suppose, the second underlining theme throughout the North Korean story about developing nuclear weapons. That is, that with a nuclear weapons capability, the regime gets respect. gets respect, not only from the Americans, gets respect from China. It can bargain with the Chinese, it can bargain with the rest of the world, and also it can bargain with the South. Now, bargaining in this sense doesn't mean giving up the weapons, the capability in order to obtain the benefits you mentioned. It means simply moving to a higher level and to be treated accordingly, to be treated with the respect that is due for a nuclear weapon state, and that would ensure the survival of the regime, survival of the party, and so forth, and possibly, in North Korean terms, pave the way for reunification, which would come about on North Korean terms, or to at least prevent reunification on South Korean terms.
So based on what you've said there, someone might assume that the talks themselves would fluctuate quite wildly, that they'd run through like a roller coaster here of North Korea agreeing to things, then changing their minds and asking for new things and flipping on a dime. That's my sense of the talks. They run for 6 rounds, and there's multiple sessions within those 6 rounds. But it feels, I mean, this is just from my perspective here, but it feels like North Korea are happy one day and upset the next, and the smallest thing twists them, and they're very temperamental throughout these discussions.
Are you referring to the 6-party talks all the way?
Yeah, the actual 6 rounds of the 6-party talks.
And that's right. So all in an effort to gain time continually. So if they would withdraw from the talks, they would sulk, and they would have to be bribed in order to be brought in. The Chinese would have to subsidize their supposedly their travel budget in order to bring them to the talks, and they'd have to encourage them or berate them to try and get them involved. And then in many occasions, the North Koreans managed to switch the purpose of the negotiations from denuclearization to actually getting the North to the talks. So it became important for the other parties to ensure that they would continue to be present and not to upset the North Koreans. And that was a diplomatic achievement of a kind. So they were very clever in doing that, in sulking, in staying away, and raising particular issues, seemingly reasonable issues that could be met by the others, and then suddenly withdrawing those demands and moving on to a new demand. They did this continually in order to gain time, and it was a very clever effort. It should be a textbook for diplomatic negotiation.
And they have quite a few strange successes here. At one point, of course, they managed to get themselves removed from the US state sponsor of terrorism list. Right. And this is not long after them in 2006, during the 5th round of the talks itself, testing its first nuclear device.
Yes, and that is an indication of what I said previously, that Bush administration was frantically trying to reach a conclusion to these talks, some kind of settlement. And I mentioned previously they're willing to ease the conditions of verification, and this is another concession they made to remove North Korea from the list of state sponsoring terrorists. And of course, that was strongly criticized within the US. The Bush administration wouldn't have done this in 2003, but it just shows you that by 2008, how things had changed within the Bush administration, how they began to frantically reach for some kind of agreement.
And so if we start moving towards the end of these talks, as things begin to break down, there's this moment during the Bank of Delta Asia crisis when North Korean illicit funds are seized by the American government and then later released as well. Then Obama comes to power in 2008. North Korea tests another nuclear device in 2009, and they run through and in 2010 they sink a South Korean ship, and they shell this island of South Korea's coast as well. And at this point, there is really no way back, is there, for the discussions? It feels like North Korea have, if you said like they were saying they're buying for time, that they've got their time under their belt, and they're moving back towards a much more hostile view towards the world.
Right. By 2010, we had they'd withdrawn from the six-party talks in 2009, and then you had the transfer of power from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un had to go through the rite of passage. A rite of passage there was to demonstrate power, to demonstrate a willingness to resort to terrorist acts, and hence in 2010 you had the sinking of the Chonan, the South Korean frigate in March, and then the shelling of Yongpyong Island in November, which really galvanized the South Korean public because a number of civilians were killed. Yes, so this set back considerably the whole notion of negotiating dialogue with the outside world, with the Americans and with the South. And you had a conservative president in South Korea, Lee Myung-bak, who was unwilling to go back to dialogue with the North for these reasons. And so, but the North had achieved its purpose. It had obtained this, it developed this capability, and the young man who became North Korean leader had to demonstrate his power and demonstrate his willingness to resort to terrorist acts if need be before the security people, the security elite, the military within the North. Before he could take power, he had to go through this rite of passage. So yes, but the other part of the story is that for those who negotiate with the North, these things would have to be set aside, that memories of the past would have to be cast aside, because the North understood that as long as it had this capability, the missile and nuclear capability, that others would come banging on the door, so to speak, in order to deal with them, in order to negotiate with them. So they had all the cards, so to speak.
So for people listening to this, they may begin to get the feeling that this is so far a lesson on how not to undertake a serious negotiation with a rogue power. So I suppose I should ask at this point, was there any chance of success from the beginning? Were North Korea just so embedded in what they believed that there was never going to be a chance of this? Or could, in your opinion, some form of subtle diplomacy, some sort of change in attitude have actually occurred from any one of those other five powers or the international community itself to actually achieve an outcome? Or was it doomed from the start simply based on what North Korea are?
Yes, well, I don't believe in determinism in international relations, and there were particular points when it was possible to bring pressure upon the North. And I would say that had China, back in 2003, had the Chinese pressed the North, were willing, and had they been willing to resort to the kind of sanctions that they had imposed much later in last year, for example, had they been with the Russians more serious about UN Security Council sanctions upon the North, then I think the situation would have been very different. The North would have been cowed. The North wouldn't have gone ahead with some of these reckless acts that we've seen quite recently. But China was unwilling to control the situation. China was unwilling to, for its own purposes, to demonstrate that ability. So it let the North off the hook, so to speak. But I would say that 2003 was the time. The Chinese did press the North in order to bring the North into the three-party talks. That was April 2003, when they cut off the oil supply for 3 days to the North, but then they did that in a very low-key way, low-profile way. They could have done something like that repeatedly throughout the six-party negotiations in order to bring the North to heel, but they were unwilling to do that because of their own concerns, because of the concerns of the Americans. They thought that would benefit the Americans. They thought that the Americans would take advantage of the situation. But still, I think that had they done that, the situation would have been different. So
the six-party talks end in 2009 in failure, and it seems that ever since then, every time someone talks about diplomacy with North Korea, a line comes back up that we should revive the six-party talks, that we should go back to this particular framework itself. But in the interim, of course, I've mentioned the 2006 and 2009 nuclear tests. But since then, there's been a 2013 test, there's been 2 in 2016, and there was 1 last year. Right. And there was 20 missile tests last year themselves. So I just get you to look forward to this, the coming negotiations, not between South Korea and North Korea, but of course between America, South Korea, and North Korea. So what do you think will happen here? Do you think there's any chance of progress? And what do you make of people saying it shouldn't be between the 3 parties? We should broaden this out to get the 6 parties back involved.
Well, I don't think we can go back to the 6-party talks, not at all. They've had their day. And the North Koreans won't agree. They won't agree because, as we discussed just a moment ago, they're unwilling to talk about denuclearization up front. That's not on the agenda. So I don't think we're going to get denuclearization. I know there are some people who think that, we have an opportunity to denuclearize the North and so forth. No, I think we can. What is on the agenda would be an easing of tensions, and that easing of tensions may lead somewhere, or it may not. It's all very much up in the air. What the North wants, what Kim Jong-un wants, is an easing of sanctions. They, in particular, wants the Chinese to ease up on their sanctions, to go back to business as usual. And if they can get the Chinese to do that, they'll be happy and satisfied. And that means that Kim Jong-un would have to stop these provocations, stop launching ICBM missiles, would have to stop these nuclear tests in order to gain Chinese support and Chinese favor. And I think that's the agreement he came to with his recent visit to Beijing, where he met Xi Jinping. I think he understands the situation now. Ease tensions with China, ease tensions with the South, and above all, make sure that you retain your nuclear and ballistic missile capability. I think we're going to have that kind of situation. Not denuclearization, but easing of tensions.
So there is some hope there, because we haven't yet had a negotiation with this new leader himself. But listen to this, people would get the impression that maybe, and of course this is a very possible scenario, that this man is simply, he's had a very long period of testing behind him. He's spent a lot of his recent advances in missile and nuclear technology. And he is now, once again, as you mentioned, buying for time while he rebuilds his program up, and at which point he'll pull out of any future talks. Do you see this as happening or not?
Well, I think the situation has changed a bit. He'll have to be very careful about dealing with China. The Chinese don't want him to launch yet further provocations. That's the bottom line for him. And so if he wants Chinese support and favor, he'll have to abide by that agreement, that sort of implicit agreement with the Chinese. And with Chinese support, then he can if he ever gets round to it, meet Trump. He can meet Moon Jae-in in the South. But these negotiations cannot go very far, because the Chinese will always be the arbiter of the situation. They're always the key to any resolution of nuclear weapons situation in the North. And as long as Kim Jong-un can promise can accept this Chinese restraint, then things will continue as they are.
So on that point, just as a final question here, it's important to at least look at the character of the person who's going to be having these discussions. So looking at Donald Trump, of course, he's quite brash and he shoots from the hip, and he seems to be quite an impulsive character. Is there any value of having someone like that involved in this discussion? Because this will, of course, be a direct negotiation between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And, of course, it's hard to imagine both men being too affected by their advisors. Well, maybe Kim Jong-un is, we wouldn't know.
Well, we don't know if this is going to happen, where they're going to meet. They may meet at Panmunjom, or Donald Trump may fly to Pyongyang. I doubt if he'll fly to Pyongyang. They may meet at Panmunjom. I'm skeptical. I think there's a 10-20% chance that this event won't happen. Then Trump will be hemmed in he seems to be very unconcerned and ignorant of the restraints to American policy in the Korean situation in relation to North Korea, but he'll be hemmed in and constrained by the alliance with Japan, the alliance with the South, and he can't make promises to Kim Jong-un to the detriment of those alliances. And I think if he realizes that, and there'll be someone, his new national security advisor, John Bolton, I think will make sure of that. So in which case, the possibility for some kind of breakthrough will be very limited on the American side.
Do you think the hovering over all this, the shadow of the Iranian nuclear deal, has any particular impact? I mean, it must have some, but of course John Bolton was always quite a hawk on this issue back in the day, and Donald Trump speaks about it an awful lot. So if we round off on this, does the shadow of Iran really impact this, or is this a side issue that people just like to talk about?
Yes, well, there were commentators who thought that the Iranian the agreement could somehow act as a precedent or negotiations with the North, but this has been strongly criticized within the United States. I know that there are Israelis like Ehud Barak who says that it may be a bad agreement, it's the only agreement we have, but it's still strongly criticized, and John Bolton himself is a very vocal critic. So I don't think this will have much bearing on negotiations with the North at all.
Well, Leszek Buszynski, it's been a pleasure. Your book is called Negotiating with North Korea, the Six-Party Talks and the Nuclear Issue. I can't recommend it enough. And thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much.